All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us from the West Coast. Welcome to the Canadian Experience, a pathway to a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy diagnosis in Canada. My name is Hamira Osman. I'm the VP of Research and Public Policy. My colleague Zainab is here today, and she will be discussing and setting the stage first on what is limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Zainab.
Thanks, Amira. So as Amira mentioned, I just want to set the stage and give a brief overview of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is comprised of a diverse group of disorders and contains several subtypes and is usually characterized by weakness in the proximal muscles around the hips and shoulders. When we use the word proximal, we're referring to the muscles that are closest to the center of the body. And LGMD is as the name describes, affects the shoulder girdle and the muscles around the shoulder and the muscles around the pelvic girdle. Next slide, please. And so LGMD is caused by spelling mistakes or mutations in the different genes that are related to LGMD. One thing to note is that these genes are associated with certain proteins within the muscle that play vital roles in muscle function, regulation, and repair. When any of these important proteins are missing or non-functional, it causes LGMD. And it's important to mention that there are more than 30 genes associated with LGMD, and that it is a recessive disorder which can be genetically inherited from either of the affected parents. LGMD also affects approximately 1 in 14,500 Canadians. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, LGMD consists of several types and subtypes. And one thing to note is that these types are classified by the way in which the condition is inherited. Whether one or both parents are affected by LGMD will result in various inheritance patterns. The LGMD subtypes are often grouped according to the protein that is affected in the muscle. Next slide. There are a number of symptoms that affect those with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and will vary across the different types and subtypes, where some may present with more severe symptoms compared to others. And we have a list of symptoms on the slide that are commonly reported in those with LGMD. Next slide, please. And limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is diagnosed through a variety of tests where genetic testing is ideal, but it is commonly diagnosed through muscle biopsies in most cases. Next slide, please. And while there are no cures for LGMD, the goal of treatment is to enhance the quality of life. And so there are a number of supportive treatments that can help manage the symptoms in those with LGMD, including physical therapy, exercise, mobility aids, and respiratory monitoring. I will now pass it back over to Hamira to set the stage for our study and why we wanted to capture this journey.
Thanks so much, Zainab. So why do we want to capture that diagnosis journey for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy? Well, we should first start to say that there's this term called diagnostic odyssey. And really what that means is there can be some challenges in getting an accurate diagnosis in a timely way. There can be what's called false starts or misdiagnoses. And as Zainab showed you on the screen, the clinical symptoms that come with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, they can be really common with other neuromuscular conditions that often fall under MDC's umbrella. And so what you're seeing on your screen is when I just looked in the literature, just in the past few years, you can see some publications where there have been studies where limb girdle has been misdiagnosed as polymyositis or FSHD or Pompe disease or Becker muscular dystrophy. And what we know is when there is a misdiagnosis, it can have a snowball effect. And what that means is it can really impact your participation at work, how you're feeling by the time you're able to access rehabilitation, but it can also extend to other family members. So actually in our study, we spoke to someone who said, I received a Becker muscular dystrophy diagnosis, and that's because my brother had received a Becker muscular dystrophy diagnosis. So I had assumed that that's what I had as well, or the clinicians had assumed. And it wasn't until many years later that I received an accurate diagnosis of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So how did we want to approach this work? Well, we wanted to reach out and get first-hand experiences. So we went ahead and invited Canadians with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, confirmed diagnoses, to participate in a survey that was available in English and in French. We conducted the survey online, but also did phone interviews as well for some who would want to offer their information that way. And the survey was really in three major parts. What were your signs and symptoms at the beginning? What was the diagnostic workup like? What did it feel like getting a diagnosis? And what were the tests like? And then what's life like today now that you have a confirmed diagnosis? We had a really good response. We heard from 108 people with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and their caregivers. And the reason why I mentioned caregivers is we did have parents who also completed the survey on behalf of children affected by LGMD. To our knowledge, this is the largest study of its kind in Canada. The average age of people with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy that responded was about 35 years of age, with a range of 2 to 85. And we had almost a split in terms of males and females. When we do look at the demographics, it does really resemble and has of what the Canadian larger LGMD population looks like. So let's go ahead now and talk about symptom onset. So when we asked our participants, what were your initial symptoms and when did that really occur? The average age at which symptoms were bothersome, noticeable, was around 21 years of age. But again, there's this range. There's this range of some people really appreciated and saw the symptoms earlier on at age 2, and others upwards of mentioning age 62. On average, participants did not see a healthcare professional for about 4 years from that time of symptom onset, and that even ranged to upwards of 25 years. Now, this is somewhat consistent with what we see in the literature. While not in Canada, there have been reported studies that have looked at symptoms of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and that ranges between 13 to 25. And typically, it takes about 5 years before people notice a bothersome symptom to going into seeing a clinician. And so when you are experiencing these symptoms, we ask, well, who did you talk to? And what you really can just appreciate from this graph is most people went to their informal networks first, parents, family members, spouse, partner, friends, to really say something is off, something doesn't feel right. What are your thoughts? After seeking out an informal network, they did go more formally, and that tended to be a general practitioner, tended to be a family doctor. 70% of the time, participants said my first healthcare touch point was with the general practitioner, whereby I shared those initial symptoms. Only 21% said, I really spoke to my initial symptoms to a neurologist. The ER was mentioned a lot, or seeing other specialists, but again, most commonly, it was the general practitioner. And so then we asked, well, when you look back, what were those initial bothersome symptoms? What were those top symptoms that made you think something is off, something is not right? It was difficulty with stairs that emerged as a top response. Difficulty with stairs really let people know that something wasn't right. There was more than muscle weakness here. Lack of stamina, fatigue was often mentioned. Frequent falls. Interestingly, walking on tiptoes was really common in the responses here. You had one individual say, I was experiencing problems with my legs, a lack of strength, unable to run due to the fact that I walked on my toes. So really, which symptoms prompted people to go in and see that first touch point, that healthcare professional? It was a physical symptom for the majority of the participants. Oftentimes, it was these physical symptoms that then really launched them into going to see a healthcare professional. For some participants, they said, well, we have a family history of limb-girdle, and that really prompted me to go see a healthcare professional. And then very few noted that they had family members or doctors recommend that they go visit a neurologist based on some symptoms that they observed, or if there was unusual blood work like an elevated CK. So we did ask, what were the impacts of those initial symptoms. And what you're seeing here is just a graphic of our thematic analysis. A thematic analysis is where we code what we heard into different categories, and two different raters look at this information and then they try to develop what are the categories, what are those experiences. And the categories that really came about is, well, limb girdle and its symptoms has an impact on daily living, activities of daily living. It really impacts mobility and independence. It impacts how people participate in at work or in school. It impacts how people feel. It impacts how people develop as people and how they engage in relationships, make friends, engage with peers, and with family members. And so if we even kind of look a little bit deeper into one of these categories, like activities of daily living, people reported that they didn't have a lot of strength to complete tasks like combing their hair, dressing, feeling a lot of fatigue after a simple task, having some challenges with childcare, having difficulty engaging in housework or chores. And so we said, when you did initially experience these symptoms, where did you look to? And oftentimes people said, well, I looked online. I looked online. I Googled my symptoms, or I reached out to a healthcare professional. If there was a family history, I asked the person with the confirmed diagnosis. Very few talked about going into books and looking at the literature. Some participants said, I didn't actually look for any information. And some said they looked at Muscular Dystrophy Canada, which would make sense because, again, a lot of those initial symptoms really resemble other neuromuscular conditions that we cover. So now let's look at the next phase. So now you're trying to get that diagnosis. You've been experiencing these symptoms, so now let's move forward to getting that diagnosis. The majority of the participants in our study did not have a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy diagnosis in their families. And so with that, it makes sense that there was limited awareness of LGMD. Even when they put it in the search engine on Google, limb girdle wasn't coming up as a top result or even in the top 10 results. So very limited knowledge on what is limb girdle muscular dystrophy. And participants found the following resources relatively helpful during the process. They found medical professionals, websites, information that was offered as part of genetic testing, support groups, and family and close friends helpful. This is actually, confirmed by one of our clients who actually is featured in an awareness video on limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, whereby Christina started to experience symptoms at age 12 for limb-girdle. She shares, my parents and I had never heard of neuromuscular disorders before. This was a new world to us. There were a lot of questions and tests and doctors weren't able to give us clear information about what this would mean for me going forward. It was hard to get answers to these really important questions. So now let's really focus on this concept of around time to diagnosis. In our study, we asked, okay, from that time of that first symptom to the time where you received a confirmed diagnosis of limb-girdle, how many months, how many days, how many years passed by? On average, 8 years. With upwards of 34 years. People waited 34 years with either a misdiagnosis or no diagnosis until they received that LGMD diagnosis. And sometimes participants waited up to 2 years before receiving that diagnostic result. In the literature, this is often reported about 6.5 years from the time of first symptom to diagnosis. Oftentimes people received misdiagnoses, just like when we spoke about the beginning around what was the rationale for doing this work? What was that reason? The intention here is because there are misdiagnoses, and as we expect and as it's in the literature, Becker muscular dystrophy really came up often, FSHD came up, myopathies, chronic fatigue, rheumatoid arthritis, polymyositis. But there were also some other conditions or behaviors that were mentioned by healthcare professionals. People received comments like, it's all in your head, or it's a bad habit you're going to have to kick in terms of toe walking, or you're a lazier walker or a clumsier walker, were some of the comments made to people ahead of a formal diagnosis. The majority of the participants who participated in our study had a confirmed diagnosis through genetic testing. As Zainab beautifully laid out, there are different ways to receive a limb-girdle diagnosis: muscle biopsy or through clinical history. But genetic diagnosis, getting a genetic testing is a great way. It's a really good way to get a confirmed diagnosis, which can also lend to telling you about the type of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy that you have. With that in mind, however, 62% of participants said, I had a really difficult time getting a diagnosis. And those barriers were that healthcare professionals weren't listening. They weren't willing to help. There was a long wait time to get genetic testing. Sometimes they said that I got genetic testing, but it was inconclusive, or there was a long travel time to get to a specialist to even access genetic testing. And so about 37% of participants said the access to testing was poor in Canada. The cost of testing was challenging for a small subset, but some individuals. That the mode of testing was challenging or poor, 30% reported this. And that 35% of participants said that they didn't get a timely access to a result. It's good news, however, that a very small percentage experienced any adverse side effects from testing for LGMD. The majority said it was relatively easy once they did get access to the test to get a genetic test for LGMD. And so then we did ask, how did you feel about testing? The most common response was, I felt hopeless and depressed at the time that I received a genetic testing. But it was mixed emotions. Some said, I felt really relieved. I felt validated. I felt finally I have the right name to how I'm feeling. This is now the label in terms of it really matches with how I'm feeling. Some were shocked and surprised. Some, again, in line with those adverse side effects, felt like the testing procedures and the process was painful. Some felt I received the diagnosis when I was young. I was a child or a youth, and I didn't really understand the diagnosis. Some felt really dissatisfied. So I was told I had this diagnosis, but I didn't feel like it was followed up with the right supports or attention. Some felt there was a lot of anxiety, fear, and stress attributed to getting a diagnosis of LGMD. And some expected to receive this diagnosis because there was a family history. About 41% of people who responded to our survey were overall satisfied with the diagnostic process. 42% were overall satisfied with the information given. 57% were overall satisfied with the professionalism. These are not strong numbers. These are great areas for us to improve that diagnostic process and experience for Canadians with limb-girdle. 33% was dissatisfied with the support offered post-diagnosis. And so when we asked, as we're doing this work, really to improve the outcomes, improve the experiences, we said, well, what were the initial questions that you had? Questions about the future, questions about life expectancy. Questions came up about, how do I manage these symptoms? Are there clinical trials? Are there research opportunities? What about family planning? Is this inherited? And then why is this happening to me? What is the cause? Would often come up. 49%, close to 50% of our participants said that they were given information about limb-girdle at the time of the diagnosis, but a fourth said, but that information wasn't very helpful. Very few were referred to, support services or organizations like Muscular Dystrophy Canada that offer help and assistance for those with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. As you know, that I just said that the majority of our participants did receive a genetic test, and this was the types of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy that were reported from those participants. Some reported that they did not know the type, but these were the more common ones. And a few respondents noted that they didn't have an exact genetic subtype, but they were told that they clinically presented as limb-girdle. And so, as mentioned earlier, there can be misdiagnoses where you can be told you have Becker or FSHD, and it's actually limb-girdle. It could also be the other way around, where you're told you have limb-girdle, but in actuality, you might have another condition. And so, limb-girdle muscular dystrophy can mimic autoimmune disorders. And so patients who have a presumed limb-girdle muscular dystrophy diagnosis, but genetic testing doesn't necessarily show that, could be tested for anti-HMGCR autoantibodies. And if that is the case, if you are someone who has an anti-HMGCR myopathy, there's actually treatments for it, and people have found that that has been really helpful. So one of our clients, Jenna Kendall, was diagnosed with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy at age 16. And then 23 years later, and she was always told she has limb-girdle. She was quite active, and she really came across a research article where she talked about, or she came across that limb-girdle muscular dystrophy could resemble anti-HMGCR. She had worked together with her clinician and was tested for those autoantibodies. Sure enough, she actually has this autoimmune condition, and now is receiving treatment and is responding well to treatment. And so what information should be offered? We asked people who received this diagnosis of limb-girdle, what do you think should be offered during diagnosis? It was that we should have scientific articles. We should have the latest evidence be offered in a way that's plain language and easy to understand. We should have access to support groups. We should have referrals to organizations like MDC. We should have information on clinical trials. We should have this really good information on limb-girdle, ways that I can even raise that with my employer or with my family, with my friends. We should have access to government supports and services because some of these symptoms are generalized or can be slowly progressive for some people. They felt like they didn't always qualify for disability supports. There should be leaflets and brochures, again in plain language that is easy to understand limb-girdle. And there should be access to specialist care as well. And so even having a list of clinical contacts, physiotherapists who are familiar with limb-girdle would have been helpful. And so this individual shared, our diagnosis was terribly grim when there was actually a lot of potential and hope on the horizon, told untrue information about our specific limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So I would hope that no one else has to go through that. What would have made the diagnostic experience easier? Top answer, having more knowledgeable healthcare professionals, having access to those support services. Again, in line with the previous slide, having accurate information, evidence-based information, up-to-date information, and having an accurate diagnosis. You know, an individual said, I had to make career changes 3 times. So knowing this would have helped me to find one where I can't do this job later on in life. And so now they're on disability support and really struggling with the costs related to the disability with limb-girdle. And so we did ask whether folks would have wanted to receive a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy diagnosis earlier on. For some people, as I mentioned, it can be progressive. It can be progressive, but also at a slower rate. But approximately 60% said, no, I wish I knew earlier. And when we did ask, those did tend to be people with more progressive forms, but people would appreciate, even in the absence of a cure, in the absence of, support, a treatment directly for limb-girdle, people wish they knew earlier so they can make changes in terms of getting interventions, getting rehabilitation, supplements, supportive care earlier on. When we ask folks to reflect on their diagnostic experiences, people really spoke about that it could be really traumatizing. This individual said, the process was very traumatizing. I have 2 small children. If it wasn't for my faith, I don't know where I would be. My family doctor had no idea what muscular dystrophy was. She was not educated within that field. She said, I really don't know what's going on. And then I received a phone call from a rheumatologist, and within a 2-minute conversation, I was told I have limb-girdle. I asked what that means, and she said, eventually you won't be able to walk. That first phone call has left this person feeling traumatized. Another person said, it appears to me that the diagnosis of a progressive disease with exceptionally variable and personal timelines is difficult for the patient and attending doctors. I'm grateful that I have an annual checkup with my neurologist. However, I still feel that my personal research is what keeps me abreast of developments. I also accept that research dollars are going to be focused on larger cohorts of muscular dystrophy. However, I really wish there was literature that was easily accessed and made readily available to me given my diagnosis. And so now let's look at beyond the diagnosis. And so, beyond getting a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy diagnosis, Canadians reported that they have challenges in performing activities and social activities. There are some challenges that limb-girdle presents from a mobility and independence perspective. Challenges in terms of getting support from government and healthcare professionals. Challenges with people understanding what limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is. Some people reported being in wheelchairs and really quickly others appreciating that they have a disability, while others saying, because I am able to walk or walk sometimes or walk certain distances, I'm not always told understood to have a muscle weakness or a neuromuscular condition. That there's increased costs and financial limitations, and that there's lack of available treatments and lack of access to clinical trials in Canada. This slide really helps to capture that impact of living with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. There's this physical impact. There's that direct impact on health. But there's also some indirect impacts outside of those muscles, like on cardiovascular, pulmonary. There's that emotional and social impact, can lead to isolation, distress, depression, some challenges with body image, limitation in participating in certain roles or activities, and has the potential for impacting not only the person, but also family members as well. There's also an economic impact, as already been shown. It can contribute to direct medical costs or indirect costs, such as accessing physiotherapy or supplements or time away from work to go to appointments. As well. And so with that, we are currently looking at the costs of living with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy in Canada. If you haven't completed the survey, I really encourage you to do so. As treatments and therapies are in the pipeline and eventually will come to Canada, this is good information for us to present to drug regulators and those who make decisions on reimbursements to demonstrate the cost related to living with limb-girdle. This is a relatively short study survey, and we can make it as easy as possible. We'd be happy to complete this by phone or over Zoom to really hear from your experiences and to capture those indirect costs. We did ask that if you did meet another Canadian with a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy diagnosis today, what would you say to them? And really, the people that participate in the study are resilient. They are positive and they are educated. They know a lot about limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and about really taking good care of their body. They also said as much as they were resilient and active in advocating for their care, and for disability-related supports, that it was important to pause and ask for support, to really ask for support around income supports or accessing therapies or assistive devices and technologies. And so with that, I remind you all that MDC is here to support. LGMD is part of our umbrella of conditions that we cover. We have service specialists, system navigators in almost every province and every part of the country that is happy to support you with navigating complex systems in the school, at home, clinically, finding a specialist, finding a physiotherapist, getting support and funding with assistive devices, technologies, medical equipment. In the community, helping to do presentations at school or work to better understand limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, working alongside you to advocate for any of the challenges that you might face. We also have a research hotline that's nested within our system navigation program. If you need help getting a genetic test, finding a clinical trial, understanding what the clinical trials out there are and what those therapies are all about, finding specialists, getting accurate information, you can always reach out to us. Hey, I saw this article. What does it really mean? How does it impact me and my diagnosis? And so I'm going to go ahead and pause now and invite one of our clients, Priyam, who received a diagnosis 25 years after experiencing symptoms of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And, you know, as we do this work, we work with patient research partners, people with lived experience and lived expertise on limb-girdle. But I really invite you as a partner, Priyam, to share what you've heard today. Does this resonate with your experiences? What seems right? What seems different? Be happy to hear more from you.
Thank you, Hamira, and welcome everybody. Good morning and good afternoon to all of our listeners. I have to start right off the bat by saying this is a fantastic presentation, and even the survey that was sent out, asked very poignant questions and questions that made me feel like finally somebody understands. So having lived and living with 25 years of uncertainty and confusion and feeling isolated, it was refreshing to even just read the survey questions. So thank you to MDC for putting that together. But I'm also surprised at myself for talking today because I'm one of those people who didn't want to know anything about muscular dystrophy or anything. And I was very upset with the diagnosis. So I'll go back a little bit in my past and I'll share with everyone my personal journey. And the slide says, did we get it right? And yes, you did. Humira and Zainab, you did. So thank you again. So I am 49 years old. I'm a single parent of 2 children. I have 2 boys, aged 20 and 16. And I first started having symptoms when I was 24. So it's been 25 years now. There was no family history of muscular dystrophy or any type of neuromuscular disorder. Other than cancer, there was really no disease in the family on going back generations. So it was a shock when I got the diagnosis, but there was quite a journey leading up to today. So I think I need to take you back to when I was born to really get the story straight. So I was born with an atrial septal defect. So it's a hole in the heart. So when I was 2.5 years old, I had open heart surgery to correct that and never had any problems since then. When I was 4 years old, I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis in my left knee. And I was followed heavily at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto by a rheumatologist from the age of 4 to 14 years of age. When I was 12, for whatever reason, I cannot recall now, but somehow the rheumatologist that was following me for the arthritis saw abnormal blood results where my CPK level, or creatinine phosphokinase, was extremely high. I think the normal range is something in the low hundreds, and I was at 6,000, my reading, so extremely high. The doctor was concerned and wanted to do a muscle biopsy. And I was 12 years old. I had no idea what was going on, and I don't even know if my parents knew what was going on. My mom's first language is not English, so she didn't really understand. There was a language barrier there. So I'm not sure if they understood but didn't tell me what was going on. But at the end of the day, I had no idea what was going on. All I knew was I was admitted to Sick Kids for a week. They ran a bunch of tests and did a muscle biopsy on my tricep, so on my arm. And the muscle biopsy came back negative. And the doctor said, oh, well, we probably took the wrong muscle. So that's what I heard from my parents. Oh, they think they took the wrong muscle. Just carry on with life. Okay, so that was the end of that. And I never thought about it again. When the arthritis cleared up when I was 14, then I stopped seeing the rheumatologist at Sick Kids, and I had no more issues with the arthritis. I was strong. I was carrying on in school like all the other kids. And then finally, let's fast forward to when I was 24. So 10 years after I last saw the rheumatologist, he contacted me and said he was doing a 10-year study, 10-year post-treatment study for his rheumatoid arthritis patients, and was wondering if I would be interested in participating. And so I thought, oh, that would be fantastic. I'd love to see you again. Of course, let's do this. So I met with him in his office, and he started doing some testing like when we did when I was younger. And one of the tests was I had to lie down on my side and lift my leg up. And he was going to push down on my leg. And we had done this over and over when I was younger, from the age of 4 to 14. It was normal. I was able to do it, no problem. This time I laid down on my side, I lifted up my leg, and before he even tried to push against my leg was slowly falling back down onto the bed. And that caught me by surprise, and same with him. And he said, try that again. So, okay. So I lifted the leg up, and again, the leg went up, but I couldn't keep it up there. Slowly, it was falling down. And then I started thinking, you know what? Around that time, I had joined a Pilates class. And so my whole life, even though I was strong as an ox up until that time, up until about 24, I was never very sporty. I wasn't very into sports, or I wasn't athletic. So I never joined any exercise classes, but for some reason, when I was 24, around the same time that I saw the rheumatologist again, I had decided for whatever reason I was going to join a Pilates class. It was the first exercise class I'd ever joined in my life. And in that class, there was one move in there where we had to lie down on our stomachs and we had to lift our leg up behind us off the floor. And I couldn't get my leg up either. And I remember calling over the Pilates instructor and saying, "Oh, how do we do this? I can't get my leg off the floor." And she's like, "Oh," she kind of shrugged it off. I don't know if she knew that there was an issue, but she shrugged it off. And then I brushed it off as well. And I thought, "Oh, I just must be tired today. Okay, whatever." And I shrugged it off and I did the other exercises. But now, going back to the rheumatologist, and I saw the look of concern on his face when he saw my leg dropping down. And then I realized, okay, so maybe I'm not just tired today. Maybe there's something else going on. And next thing you know, he was getting me in to see adult neurologists, because he was a pediatric rheumatologist. He referred me, he made all sorts of referrals. So that opened up a whole Pandora's box of medical professionals. And I was seen by multiple neurologists, multiple physiatrists. No one really knew what I had. And so this would have been around the late 90s at this point. And I noticed in the PowerPoint slides that some studies have shown that the lead time to a proper diagnosis was shorter in the 2000s. And I can see that because in the late 90s, it didn't seem like anybody really knew what was going on, at least not with me. At first, they thought I had polymyositis. Then they did mention limb-girdle at one point, but then they also mentioned FSHD, facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy. And so they said, well, we'll do some blood work and we'll do some genetic testing. And so, of course, test results came back inconclusive. I was in the gray zone, apparently, for FSHD. And they said, okay, well, it's inconclusive. You're in the gray zone, but we think you have FSHD. And so that was what I was diagnosed with when I was 24. And they said, but we want to confirm and do another muscle biopsy. And I said, okay. Now I was hesitant. Now I'm 24. I knew what was going on. I knew what a muscle biopsy was. When I had the muscle biopsy when I was 12, that was not a pleasant experience. And I didn't want to go through that again. So I voiced my concern. I said, well, last time, it was negative. They told me they took the wrong muscle. I don't want to, I'm not a piece of meat. I don't want you to keep chopping me up until you find what you're looking for. I'm a little concerned about going through another muscle biopsy. And the doctor said, well, what do you care? You're not a model. And then I said, okay, that's enough. I was more depressed leaving the doctor's office than I was going in there. And I put an end to all doctors after that. The doctor, that was neurologist number 2, after neurologist number 1 heard that I didn't want to do the muscle biopsy, she was upset with me because I wasted her time, because she was trying to pull all these strings to get me into quicker appointments and to try and get the muscle biopsy done. And I thought, oh, I can't continue with this. It was too upsetting for me to have this feedback from the doctors. And so I just put an end to it altogether. So I was 24. At that point, I was engaged and I started debating, should I get married? I didn't have children yet. Should I have children? So I had all these questions, but nobody had answers for me. At that time, all the doctors were very good at telling me everything I would not be able to do in life. Not once did they tell me what I would be able to do. They told me there was no cure. And when I can't even recall if I asked if there was treatment or if my parents asked if there was treatment, but for some reason I walked away thinking there was no treatment. So I guess they didn't have anything positive to tell me. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to live my life. Um, I'm happier without seeing the doctors. So that's what I'm going to do. So that's what I did until I was about, well, maybe a good 10, 15 years without seeing any doctors. I got married. I had children. And then at one point, somebody told me about a doctor who was very positive and supportive, a neuromuscular doctor. And they said, you know, apparently now there are more advances and more research, and there's positive news. You should reconsider and see the doctor again. And so I said, okay, well, let's give it a try. Okay. So I did. And yes, he's all positive. He's fantastic. He is all positive. And I've continued with him and I see him annually. But, you know, the journey has been quite stressful, to say the least. For me, I think what made me not want to know anything about muscular dystrophy or limb girdle dystrophy, I think was probably because my childhood, I felt I was poked and prodded by all sorts of doctors with the arthritis. I don't remember, you know, when I had the open heart surgery, I was too young, but I just thought going through childhood, being poked and prodded, I didn't want to go through that in my adulthood. So I put an end to it. But now I think finally at the age of 49, better late than never, I think, you know what? I think we do need education. We need greater awareness. We need to talk. We need to share. And that's how we will get this right and get it even better and more positive for all of us, because it's traumatizing. So one person called it traumatizing. She had 2 young children and relied on faith. I've got to tell you, with my children now, you know, I debated whether I should have children because I thought I would never want to pass this on to somebody else. And then I thought, wait a minute, my life is good. I'm basically saying that my life is not worth living by some of the thoughts that were going through my head. So I thought, you know what? By the time my children are older, if they only get affected a few years from when I started having symptoms, there will be greater advancements. And there have been. And even if, you know, if they do have the disease, there are options. And I think that's what we have to remember. There are options, there are support groups. You know, it's better and it's getting better every day, I would say. I've certainly seen differences from the late 90s up until now. I've certainly seen differences. Somebody mentioned vocational. And I think that's important. So if you are young and you're choosing a career path, choose one where you will be able to continue, because that will help. Fortunately for me, I have a job where I can be financially independent, which makes a big difference. But it's at the same time probably maybe a bit of a curse as well, because it's a desk job. So I can continue working at my desk. In fact, I can run marathons in terms of how long I can sit at my desk for. But at the same time, that means I'm not active, and I see a difference sitting too much at my desk, where at the end of the day, when I get up, I'm stiff. It's more difficult, and that's gotten worse over the years. But I do know somebody who also has limb girdle, who trained to be a veterinary technician, and she couldn't pick up the animals at one point, and she had to change and sort of refocus her career. So I think, you know, I'm grateful that at least I do have a job that I can continue, and it's something that I love to do and I can do long term with my type of job. So I would recommend and suggest for people who are choosing their future in terms of employment, then keep that in mind about long-term options. But for me, fortunately, there's no pain. But again, symptoms are the same. Difficulty going up and down stairs. They are now impossible unless there's a handrail. And even with a handrail, if the rise is too big, will be difficult. So the rise has to be as small as possible. And no running, cannot run at all. There are no sports, cannot bend down to pick anything up from the ground. So, golfing, things that other people play, I wouldn't be able to pick up the golf ball from the ground, or throwing a ball with my kids. I could never do that, because if I drop the ball, well, they'll have to come get it for me, put it back in my hand so I can throw it. So things like that. But overall, I think there are different ways of still living life. And I think that's the take home message we have to remember. There are still things you can do. You just do it differently. Like somebody mentioned, brushing your hair. I cannot brush my hair freely either. I'll have to prop my elbow on the wall to get the support to brush my hair. But there are different ways. And I think that's what we have to be. We have to be creative and finding different ways that we can accommodate ourselves, because I do feel that people are not educated, even medical professionals who are trained in this field. I found they don't get it. They don't get it. When I was pregnant with my first son, my obstetrician felt, well, maybe you should see a multidisciplinary team who will help you care for the baby. And I thought, okay, great. So I saw a physiatrist, an occupational therapist, a physiotherapist as a team. And I came in there and I was about 8.5 months pregnant. And we were talking and they didn't believe a word I was saying. I was telling them everything I was doing and they didn't believe me. And later on, when I had one-on-one time with the physiotherapist, she said, you know what? When you were telling us everything you were doing, we thought you were living in utopia. You were actually very functional and, we judged you wrong. And physiotherapists told me that. And I thought, oh my goodness, then how could you possibly help me if you don't believe what I'm telling you? The physiatrist, she told me to get a wheelchair. And I thought, well, how a wheelchair? At that time, I was living in a 3-story home and there were stairs everywhere. How am I going to accommodate a wheelchair and care for the baby? And, how does one go and do that? And she said, well, just move. And I thought, just move? How do you just move? I mean, at the time I was still in school too. I was still in school. I just finished exams. I'm having my first child. Now she wants me to get a wheelchair and move. And I'm thinking, what is this? Anyway, I didn't move. I stayed where I was. I found ways to deal with the baby and care for the baby. The occupational therapist told me, get a sling, put the baby in the sling. That way you don't have to hold the baby in your arms, because my arms were weak. Well, guess what? At one point I tripped and fell with the baby in the sling and both of us crashed on the floor. So that wasn't safe either. And I thought, okay, here I had a multidisciplinary team who were supposed to be experts in the field and they didn't get it. And then again, so I was about 29 at that point, and I thought, okay, that's it. That's enough. I gave this a try. I'm not seeing doctors anymore again. So I went through lulls where I thought, you know what? I know me best. I know my body best. I know what I can and cannot do. I think I'm pretty realistic. I'm just going to live my life. And that's what I have, right? So, here we are, age 49. Marriage didn't last, I got to say that, but I can still do it. Single parent, 2 beautiful boys. They are strong as an ox. They are, I don't know whose genes they got, but they're actually super athletes. They're more athletic than anyone I know. But all that to say, don't give up, stay positive, and reach out and talk and share. And it's uplifting to hear other people's stories, because you realize you're not alone. And there are a lot of resources out there in terms of literature, people that you can talk to. There are good doctors out there and good healthcare professionals who will get you and will understand. And you just have to keep faith, and stay strong. Stay strong.
Thanks so much, Priyam. I think that thank you for your trust in sharing your story and for the time in doing so. You know, as much as we can engage in really robust research and offer those percentages and reach out to hundreds or over 100 Canadians with this condition, it's so powerful to hear your story and to hear your experiences. And it is really helpful for an organization like MDC because it allows us to then launch into, well, what do we do with this information? Of course, there's limited research. So of course, we would have to go ahead and publish this information. It's really important that we disseminate this research. But in addition to that, knowing about the barriers that were shared with us, how do we help to address those barriers? If there's barriers to accessing genetic testing or accessing genetic testing because of the costs related to it, how do we look into opportunities to support this? There was also a lot of lack of awareness or lack of information. Can we develop knowledge translation products or tools to build that awareness? Or can we also leverage information from here to support advocacy cases around genetic testing coverage and access by province and territory? There were very limited clinical trial opportunities in Canada. How do we make sure that industry partners are making sure that they set up sites within Canada for clinical trials for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy? We heard that limb-girdle is not just about the diagnosis itself, it's about living life with that condition. So how do we offer wraparound supports for Canadians and their families? And how do we really get the data? How do we really get the information to really inform future treatments, therapies, programs, services, and ultimately improve the quality of life for people with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy? Does that look at capturing the natural history? How does limb-girdle muscular dystrophy present? What are typical health outcomes? How does that progression look like? What are experiences with clinic, but also with our system navigation program as well? And so with that, I want to thank all of you for your interest in this work, for those that participated in this project. Thank you for trusting us. You know, we would not get as robust and enriching insights without your trust, without your support, without your input. I'd also like to thank Sarepta. Sarepta helped to fund and make this project possible. We were one of the awardees out of, in addition to two other countries, if I'm not mistaken, to work on an educational project like this. The support from Sarepta is really important as we're a health charity and we really rely on generous donors. So we really appreciate the support that we receive from Sarepta Therapeutics to execute this project. And we're really excited and really motivated to now move this forward from research into action. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause and welcome any questions in the last few minutes of today's webinar. Wonderful. And I am getting confirmation that the countries that did receive funding were Canada, and MDC received that funding, India, South Africa, and US. So again, it's really, as Priyam talked about, really exciting to see the evolution in terms of that investments in research, investments in projects for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy from the 90s to the early 2000s to now in 2023 as we approach the end of the year, to have the largest of its kind study here in Canada looking at the experiences of limb-girdle and really looking at it beyond that diagnosis. I think that's what we're most proud of as well. Wonderful. So I'm seeing a lot of positive comments come in terms of really finding that their story matches with others. A lot of comments also for you, Priyam, to really say it's brave of you to share the story, and it's really helpful to hear your story as well. So this is great. So on that note, I welcome you to email any questions you might have to research@muscle.ca. Thank you again for joining today's webinar. If you think you have limb-girdle muscular dystrophy or another neuromuscular condition, feel free to reach out. If you have a confirmed diagnosis of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, please reach out. We'd be happy to support. And if you have a diagnosis of limb-girdle and you would like to follow up with genetic testing, we're also happy to help you and walk you through that process and get you connected to the right people. So thank you again. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for your support. Have a good rest of your day. Take care, everyone.